Joining us now for more from Pretoria in South Africa is Akinola Olojo. He's a senior researcher in transnational threats and international crime at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. From London, Raffaello Pantucci, Director of International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. Via Skype from Virginia, Kamran Bokhari is a fellow with the Program of Extremism at George Washington University. And here in the studio, Vincent is a global security and counterterrorism expert who has previously served in the US government and advises them to this day. Well, okay, we've seen a downtick in terrorism globally, but an uptick in certain countries, especially in Africa, Cameroon and Kenya. So let's start in Africa. Akinola, what's the situation on the ground in Africa? Less headlines in the West, but still very much so a threat in some parts of Africa, and we're talking probably East and West Africa the most, right? Indeed.
Yes, well, based on the data from the Global Terrorism Index, when we look at 2017, the preceding year, we find that there is evidence to show that there is a reduction in the frequency of attacks and also a reduction also in the fatalities that accompany these attacks. However, this does not really suggest that there is a reduction in the threats, and it explains why the attacks have persisted. Now, there is a deeper question which we need to ask. Even though data shows that frequency of attacks have reduced, we need to ask how are we able to keep on addressing these challenges? I mean, what progress are we making in terms of issues of criminal justice and safeguarding human rights, the rule of law? Are we making progress in terms of engaging this whole struggle online? Because the battlefield is actually very wide. It's more than just an engagement between conventional state armies and non-state actors. We look at the west of Africa and even the Lake Chad Basin. We have so many groups. We have in the Lake Chad Basin Boko Haram, and Boko Haram now has two factions. One which is really closely aligned with ISIS. In the Sahel, we have numerous groups from Al-Murabitun to Ansar-Din and the Masina Liberation Front, which actually have all merged to form one big coalition. If we look at the east of Africa, the Horn of Africa, we find groups such as Al-Shabaab, which is still quite active. But beyond the violent narratives, we also see African states exercising agency. We see the role of the African Union mission in Somalia. We see how they have tried to bolster the efforts of the Somali National Army against Al-Shabaab. In the Lake Chad Basin, we have the multinational joint task force with countries such as Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, all leading forces against Boko Haram and its breakaway faction. So we still have these challenges.
Peter, let's pick up on what Akinola said. You just got back from Kenya as well. We see a disconnect where terrorism is not falling as fast or still growing in certain parts of Africa, while the numbers in the West seem to be manageable, although the number of deaths are still not falling.
Nathan, we should take some comfort in the declining numbers overall globally of terrorist acts and fatalities. However, I completely agree with my colleague in that the battlefield has shifted a bit, and there is a very real threat throughout Africa. The Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the Sahel, Boko Haram, and of course Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate based in Somalia. And although the numbers in the West in terms of terrorist acts have gone down slightly, we should take no comfort in the fact that we know that these large, very well organized, very powerful terrorist organizations are very capable and still intent on hitting not only the developing world, but the West. And in fact, many of the analysts that I have spoken with, whether at NATO, the European Union, Interpol, Europol, very much fear that this is a bit of a quiet before the proverbial storm.
We're in a lull.
Absolutely, and that we should be very, very cautious of celebrating or dancing on the tombstones of groups like the Islamic State. With respect to Kenya, I have spent some quality time there back in May and then just last month working with Kenyan investigators and prosecutors. And they are literally on the front lines in their really sacred battle against al-Shabaab, which, if nothing else, is getting more emboldened and stronger. And so I think we need to not only use military and law enforcement efforts to combat the threat there, but we should look at, as my colleague suggested, other ways of addressing the problem in a non-military fashion.
Kamran Bokhari, is this a victory for the West when it comes to combating terrorism? We've seen the reversal of ISIL, for example, in Syria and parts of Iraq. Or is it, as Peter has suggested, a lull and the guard should not be let down?
I would agree with Peter. I think we're in a moment, and these things, they cycle up and they cycle down. There's every area has its own dynamics, and then of course, if you aggregate the various parts of the world and you try to measure, whether terrorism is on the rise or is it declining, we're basically talking about a moment in time. This is a very long struggle, and I don't think there should be any celebration. I don't think we should call it victory. I think this is just a moment. In fact, I would say that we have not heard, by no means, the last of ISIS. ISIS is going to, the conditions on the ground in Syria and Iraq are as such that it's only a matter of time that ISIS or a newer version of ISIS will emerge at some point in the future.
Raffaello, a lot of headlines in recent years have been terror attacks foiled or successful in Europe. You think of Nice, you think of the streets of Paris, you think of the Palace of Westminster in London, but a lot of plots, according to governments, have been foiled. Has there been some sort of success in European counterterrorism strategy?
I mean, I think that's the difficulty, that it's very difficult to evaluate when you're looking at these sorts of numbers. I mean, in terms of the absolute numbers of deaths or attacks going down, well, why is that happening? Is that happening because the groups are losing some of their potency? Is that happening because the ideology is losing its appeal? Or is it happening because the security forces are getting better at disrupting plots and figuring out how things are done and figuring out how to stay ahead of the curve? And which of those is really responsible for the downtick you might be seeing is very difficult to know. So, that's the sort of difficult element to calculate into these sorts of numbers. You can look at them and say, well, this is great, where things are going in a positive direction, but why they're going in a positive direction, it's very difficult to absolutely know. I think certainly in Europe, you have seen a bit of a catch-up, where previously, I think security forces on the continent, in Europe in particular, hadn't really seen the sort of threat picture that they were suddenly facing. And so you have a very steep learning curve, and you have a number of attacks that are able to get through. And then subsequently, what you see happening is security forces understanding a little bit better the threat that they're looking at, the networks that they're looking at, and therefore understanding how to kind of stay ahead of the curve, how to disrupt people, what to look out for, what to do to prevent an attack before it actually happens. The difficulty then is that then, of course, the threat picture will evolve. And I think that's what we saw happen here in the United Kingdom last year, where we had this series of attacks, of 5 attacks in sort of relatively quick succession in the first half of the year, where suddenly we had a whole series of things happen, but in a very new, different shape that weren't sort of from the traditional networks that people were expecting, but seemed to be from beyond that network. That's not totally true of all of them. I think the attack we saw in Manchester was probably more in the classic mold than the others, but the others sort of surprised everyone, and that marked a sort of change and a shift in understanding of how security forces here were looking at the threat picture.
Akinola, on the African continent, the US forces have been pretty aggressive when it comes to counterterrorism in the last decade or two. Are you worried about a potential complacency here as the numbers come down globally, and especially in the West, that the international reaction and the leadership that US and others have provided may slip a little bit?
Yes, I think the bigger question really is about what Africans themselves, the states affected by the crisis and the neighboring ones, and even the continent, at large, can do, because it's really about, mobilizing also from within. We need to look beyond, just, of course, like was mentioned earlier, the militarized approach, and to begin to involve local community actors. Most of the time we hear about what the state is doing. We hear about, the partnerships with other countries. We hear about how arms are being sold to African countries from the US, and, arrangements such as that. But how about those on the ground? There is a lot that is taking place. For instance, in the Lake Chad Basin, there are, groups such as the Civilian Joint Task Force, which really has been working closely with the multinational joint task force of the states. And I think it's actually time to begin to see how mobilization can be inspired from within. We need to look at how counterterrorism operations or CVE, PVE, programs can actually have or benefit from an input from local actors on the ground. Regarding issues such as being cautious about the reduction in the frequency of attacks. Just to add to that, I'd like to say that even though the figures have gone down, we also need to understand that it's important to look at the whole of society approach. And this is where the local actors come into play. This is where the national action plans of the various countries, which is obviously still evolving, must really be robust enough to move things ahead. So it's more than just partnering with other countries. That is important, but at the same time, the countries affected must be able to begin to mobilize from within.
Peter, can you pick up on that? Because obviously stopping terrorism after, combating terrorism after it's happened, reaction is obviously one part of the story, but stopping radicalization in the first place is where a lot of this effort is heading. Is that producing results?
It is producing results. And I completely agree with Akinola in that we must look to indigenous or local solutions to these very, very challenging problems. I've spent a lot of quality time with both the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security working with and living in places like Colombia and Afghanistan. And I can tell you that we have learned a lot more, frankly, from our counterparts that are literally on the front lines than, frankly, the United States has been able to teach. And I say that with all humility, but with all sincerity. I think at the point that we need to combat much more than just in a military way these very sophisticated transnational terrorist organizations. One of the keys, I believe, in countering violent extremism is working directly with locals who understand, have ground truth as to the different religious tensions or political tensions or social tensions, and to reach out to those men and women that feel marginalized and alienated and disaffected and dissatisfied, and in some cases actually disenfranchised, to help provide them with other opportunities, to work with them to provide them with educational opportunities, to provide them with employment opportunities. And that's something that's going on right now in a very serious way in Kenya, where the Kenyan authorities are working very closely with the local Somali-Kenyan refugee population, as well as individuals directly in Somalia, to understand better what their challenges are and why they're motivated to join these organizations.
Kamran Bokhari, are you seeing successes in the battle against extremism before people join terror groups, or are we still a long way away from successes here?
So I think that success or the lack thereof needs to be sort of placed in a context. And each context, each area that we're working on or our partners around the world are working on have to be looked at and examined within their own context. So, there's on many levels, we've made some significant progress. As Peter was mentioning, we've learned a lot from the mistakes that we have made, in places like Afghanistan and even in Iraq. So there's been a learning curve. It's been very steep for us, and by no means is it over. So we are beginning to see, and he's absolutely right, local partners is the way to go. I mean, we otherwise we appear as providing, foreign solutions that are deemed hostile, and we feed the narrative of our enemy that somehow, the West is out to undo Islam or basically tamper with the local culture. So I think that there is a need to continue on that front. But we need to be mindful that the solutions that we're looking for or the difference that we're trying to make is a slow and gradual process. Our enemy is working on a multi-generational timeline, and we should be under no illusion that our timeline is any different.
Raffaello, in Europe and here in the United States, terrorism can still be a political dog whistle, can't it? Especially when it's sort of mixed up with issues of immigration and otherness. Are you seeing attitudes shift as the threat seems to decrease?
I mean, I think that what we've seen in the United Kingdom, and actually probably across a bit of Europe as well, and I'd even venture to say in the United States, is you have seen an increased kind of response in some ways from the other side of this sort of ideological equation, which is the sort of extreme right wing. So here in the United Kingdom, there's been a noticeable uptick and noticeable increasing sophistication in the extreme right wing threat. And the extreme right wing threat is something that's very much emerging in some ways in response to the violent Islamist threat, in response to some of the narratives around immigration and some of the concerns that you see filtering into the sort of public discourse about, you know, these other people coming in, destroying our societies, the kind of clash of civilizations narrative. And when that becomes more mainstreamed, what you do see is that you do see that sort of extremists will say, well, okay, that's the kind of discourse in the public space now, so my ideology that sat maybe on the extreme is actually becoming more towards the middle, and so therefore I need to do something to try to activate and get more involved. So we have seen a noticeable increase in extreme right-wing activity across Europe, and I think that is in some ways a response to some of the narratives around immigration that we see going around Europe, some of the sort of issues around inequalities and a sense of sort of elites being detached from populations that we're seeing across Europe, but then also in response to some degree to the violent Islamist threat, which from there, in one analysis, is seen as sort of the extreme end of the result of this sort of immigration question in European context. So we are definitely seeing it as a very, as an element that's fitting into the political discourse, and the political discourse, of course, has an impact on these kind of narratives, because, you know, to violent Islamists who are trying to recruit people, you know, what better way to recruit people than to be able to say to them, you know, this clash of civilizations I'm saying that we're at the center of is not just, you know, me saying this. You know, you can look at the society around you and see that there is this clash of civilizations very much happening, which is why you have to become involved in the struggle.
Raffaello makes a very solid point there, Peter. I saw you nodding throughout. Obviously, the US is going through a similar debate, and a lot of this is sort of being echoed across the Atlantic. What's your take?
I completely agree with Raffaello. To speak to the US experience, the vast majority of terrorist acts that have resulted in death in the United States have been caused by white supremacists or white nationalists.
Doesn't make it to the headlines, though,
does not make it to the headlines. And I think it's incredibly important that organizations and agencies in the United States recognize this very serious threat, which appears to be growing in strength and influence, and to address it up front in a very open and honest way.
It's a bit of a counter to what you just said, but has the threat of terrorism been perhaps overemphasized since the attacks of 9/11 here in the United States? And a lot of foreign policy from Western powers, including the US, look solely through the prism of anti-terrorism, especially when it comes to developing countries. I'm going to ask the same question to Akinola in a second.
Sure. I do think that we in the West are appropriately focused on counterterrorism issues. I think tragically we fail to recognize that since September 11th, the vast majority of victims of acts of terrorism are in fact living in the developing world, and the vast majority of them, of course, are Muslims. And so I think that we focus so much on some really horrific acts of terrorism. One life lost is one life too many, but we look at what's happened in London or in Brussels or in Berlin and other places, Lyon, and the entire global community is outraged, and appropriately so. But bombs are going off almost literally every day in places like Somalia and Kenya and Nigeria, and we don't hear the sort of outrage that I think it merits.
Akinola, I'd like you to pick up on that point. We at CGTN try and report every terrorism attack around the world, and we have a great network in Africa. But I think Peter has a point here where it's not always picked up. So is the West really sort of, in a way, worried more about terrorism against its own citizens rather than dealing with the problem when it affects everyone in developing countries far more?
Oh, yes, thank you. The media, reports the attacks which take place in the Western countries. It also reports some of the attacks and the incidents in some of the developing countries. However, what I notice is sometimes the nature of reporting is what really, strikes one. For instance, in 2015, in January and November of that year, there was the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and then there was the one that happened at the Bataclan in Paris. And the level of reporting, in fact, the shock as a result of the reporting when you look at it and you evaluate its impact, it's quite different from the way the reporting in states in Africa is done. Even though that also gets attention, but the way it's also captured, and in fact the reaction of other countries to those that aspect, it's slightly different. And even on social media, you look at Facebook, for instance, and you see how so many people react when something happens in Brussels or when something happens in Paris, and then maybe even in London. But then when it happens in, say, for instance, in the northeast of Nigeria, or maybe in another part of maybe the Sahel, for instance, it's reported, but then the reaction is something that gives one, cause to worry, except in instances where you have maybe a large-scale attack. For instance, what happened in October 2017 in Somalia, which really, according to the Global Terrorism Index, was the deadliest attack last year, where about at least 500 people were killed. So when you have such large-scale attacks, then you get that kind of reaction. So I think it's about the way the reporting is done, also the reaction of the international community, but also beyond that, I think individual countries also need to take perhaps a little bit more seriously, to treat these things with a sense of urgency, when these attacks happen.
Kamran Bokhari, talk about slipping from the headlines, especially here in the US. It's very rare that we hear the word ISIL anymore when it comes to Syria or Iraq, but still 30,000 fighters reported spread around the Middle East and elsewhere. Are we becoming a little complacent again as these numbers go down?
I think so. I think that as long as something is in the headlines, as long as ISIS and jihadists are in urban areas as they were in Raqqa and Mosul, they remain, in the newsfeed. And as soon as they recede into their rural sanctuaries, we, have this sense of, all is well, the coast is clear. And then that's a sort of a false sense of security because it's only a matter of time that they will come back. And we've seen this play out in Iraq since, frankly, 2005. And so I think that it has a lot to do with how it's reported and how, it is perceived. I mean, obviously, governments have an imperative to demonstrate progress, and then that's fair. So pushing ISIL out of Mosul, pushing ISIL out of Raqqa was huge, and it should be noted as such. But that doesn't mean that the threat is over. It's just in the background, and it's only a matter of time that we're going to be talking about it again.
Raffaello, European governments desperate for political wins. Are you seeing anyone declare victory and say the war in terrorism is won, or are they worried about a threat could come from anywhere at any time?
I mean, I think that Europe has faced terrorist threats for some time in many different forms. So here in the United Kingdom, we used to worry more about Irish terrorism and Irish-related terrorism. Spain used to face the problem of ETA. France has had a consistent campaign of Corsican extremists who focus their terrorism in there. So, if you look at Europol reports, who aggregate sort of terrorist reporting from across the continent, you see that there are numerous different strains of terrorism that continue to be an issue. I think no one would here say that, terrorism is going to go away. But everyone, there is a sense that you get that the sort of threat from ISIL in particular hasn't quite evolved in the way that people were expecting. There's still this sense that a shoe hasn't dropped in terms of the returnees. So whatever happened to this big cluster of Europeans who went to fight in Syria and Iraq alongside ISIL, alongside Nusra and other groups, what's happened to them? A lot of them have been reported dead, but most European countries will say we've captured some, but we've genuinely no idea where a lot of them have gone. And so what happens to them? We still don't quite know. And so there is that concern that that might suddenly materialize in plots. But there's also a sense that it hasn't quite evolved in the way that we were expecting. So I think that the threat from ISIL, no one's going to sit down and say, well, that's done, dusted, moving on to the next thing. But it definitely hasn't evolved in the way that people were expecting. Yeah,
declare victory and move on. We've seen a sort of element of that with the Trump administration final word, Peter, where even though national security strategy has changed, terrorism is now being downsized, great power competition is back. Is that a problem for the US as it moves forward?
It is a problem, and I agree that the Western coalition that fought very successfully against the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria should get a great deal of credit for that. But the caliphate still exists as a virtual dream for those that are fully committed to engaging in acts of terrorism to achieve, again, some sort of physical caliphate. I see the so-called Islamic State now as a cornered cat. It's extraordinarily dangerous, and I think we've taken the focus a bit too much off of the Islamic State as well as Al-Qaeda, and nature abhors a vacuum, and I suspect and fear that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State will move back into so-called safe zones, countries with weak central governments, and will reach out and attack the West as well as continue to terrorize the developing world.
The evolving threat of terrorism. Peter, thank you so much, and to our guests also in Africa and Europe and beyond, a really insightful program indeed, but that's all we have time for. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us. Thank you.